What if I told you that a sunny summer day, seemingly like any other, held the power to plunge the world into chaos?
Sounds ominous.
That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Wow, okay.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914,
Okay.
and how this event became the catalyst for World War I.
Right.
But we're not just going to lay out a timeline.
No.
We're going deeper. We want to understand the emotions, the motivations, those tiny, seemingly insignificant details that converged to create this pivotal moment.
I like it.
So picture this. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The Archduke, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting.
Big event.
Huge. But the Balkans, they were a powder keg waiting to explode.
Oh, absolutely.
Set the scene for us. What was the political climate like back then? What were the major forces at play?
Well, you have to understand, the Balkans were this melting pot of ethnicities,
Yeah.
all these competing national ambitions. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Ah.
a sprawling, multi-ethnic entity,
Struggling to hold on.
desperately trying to maintain its grip. And within it,
Yeah.
various groups, especially the Slavs, yearning for independence.
And this is where Pan-Slavism comes in.
Exactly. The idea of uniting all Slavic peoples. It was a potent force, especially for those who felt marginalized within the empire.
So you have this clash of empires, ideologies, a struggle for power and identity.
Yes.
And into this volatile mix enters Gavrilo Princip.
Young Bosnian Serb.
He wasn't just some lone wolf, was he?
No, not at all. Princip was deeply influenced by the currents of Pan-Slavism.
Right.
He saw firsthand the frustrations of his people under Austro-Hungarian rule. And he became, well, increasingly radicalized. He believed violence was the only path to liberation.
So groups like Young Bosnia
Yes.
and the more shadowy Black Hand.
They provided him with a network, the means to act.
The assassination itself, it was meticulously planned, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. Princip and his co-conspirators acquired weapons through the Black Hand,
Right.
carefully plotted their attack. But what's striking is how a series of security lapses paved the way for the assassination.
Yeah, it's amazing how those seemingly small details can have such huge consequences. So what exactly went wrong?
Well, for starters, the Archduke's elite guard. They were left behind at the barracks,
What?
inexplicably. And then the driver, he made a wrong turn,
Oh, no.
deviated from the planned route. And to make matters worse, he stalled the car right in front of Princip.
Wow.
A cascade of blunders that sealed the Archduke's fate.
And Princip, seeing his opportunity, took it.
He did, fired 2 shots, fatally wounding the Archduke and his wife, Sophie. It's worth noting that Princip drew inspiration from figures like Bogdan Zarajic.
Because of that.
A young Serb who attempted to assassinate a governor became a martyr for the cause. Princip saw himself as following in his footsteps, striking a blow for Serbian freedom.
The chilling moment captured in our sources. Sophie's desperate cry, "For God's sake, what has happened to you?"
Yeah.
Franz Ferdinand's repeated insistence, "It is nothing," as if trying to downplay the severity of his wounds.
Right.
And then, Count von Herrick's account of the blood spraying from the Archduke's mouth.
Chillin'.
They make it all too real.
Absolutely. They remind us that this wasn't just a political event. It was a human tragedy.
Yes.
2 lives claimed, and a chain of events set in motion that would change the world forever.
The aftermath is fascinating, too, the contrast between the fates of the Archduke and his assassin.
Oh, it is. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were denied a state funeral. The Habsburgs, clinging to protocol, orchestrated a deliberately simple burial. It's heartbreaking, their daughter Sophie's words. God wanted Mommy and Poppy to join him at the same time.
Oh.
Meanwhile, Princip and his co-conspirators faced trial, imprisonment. Some, like Kabrinovich, expressed remorse, even received forgiveness from the Archduke's children.
Wow.
But Princip remained defiant, died in prison 4 years into the war he helped ignite.
So you have this assassination, a tragedy in itself. But then the real dominoes start to fall. Austria-Hungary sees this as an opportunity, don't they?
Oh, they did. They saw it as a chance to assert their dominance in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Emboldened by Germany's blank check of support, they issued Serbia a harsh ultimatum.
But Serbia's response wasn't entirely defiant, was it?
You're right. They actually agreed to most of the demands, tried to appease Austria-Hungary, avoid a conflict, But it wasn't enough.
Yo.
Austria-Hungary, with Germany's backing, was determined. They declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914.
Just a month after the assassination.
Exactly.
And with that declaration, the world began its descent into the abyss.
One moment you have a regional crisis, and the next, well, you're on the brink of global war.
It's crazy how quickly things escalated. How did this localized conflict explode into a world war? What role did the other European powers play?
You have to consider the web of alliances that entangled Europe at the time. Meant to maintain a balance of power, but ironically became the very mechanism that drew nation after nation into the conflict.
It's almost like a house of cards. Pull one out, the whole structure collapses.
Exactly. Russia felt obligated to defend Serbia, shared Slavic heritage bound by treaty. Their mobilization, though, was perceived as a threat by Germany. So Germany declared war on Russia, and then, because of their own commitments, they declared war on France, setting in motion the Schlieffen Plan.
A swift strike through Belgium to outmaneuver the French.
That's the one.
This web of alliances meant to prevent war actually facilitated it.
It's a tragic irony. Each nation believing they were acting defensively, protecting their interests, honoring their commitments, but they contributed to the very escalation they sought to avoid.
And then Great Britain. They were hesitant at first, but ultimately got pulled in. What was the tipping point for them?
Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality. Britain had long been a guarantor of Belgian independence. They saw the German invasion as a blatant breach of international law, a direct threat to their own security. August 4th, 1914, they declared war on Germany.
And just like that, the major powers of Europe locked in a struggle that would engulf the entire world.
What's striking is the speed at which it all happened. A few weeks after the Archduke's assassination, Europe was at war. It's a reminder of how quickly seemingly isolated events can cascade into global crises.
Now, before we delve into the horrors of the war itself, I think it's important to understand the mindset of the people back then. Did they grasp the gravity of the situation? Did they foresee the carnage that was to come?
You know, it's fascinating to look back at the public's reaction in those early days.
Yeah.
There was apprehension, of course, but also a strange sense of excitement, a naive belief that the war would be over quickly, victoriously.
Wow.
A pervasive sense of nationalism, a romanticized view of war, a test of national strength, honor.
It's almost inconceivable to us now, looking back at the horrors that unfolded.
It really is. It highlights the power of propaganda, how governments can shape public opinion. Newspapers were filled with stories of heroic soldiers, glorious victories, fueling patriotic fervor. There was this sense of inevitability. War was the natural order of things, a necessary evil to resolve disputes.
So, in a way, they were sleepwalking into a nightmare.
I think that's a very apt description. Few could have predicted the scale of the devastation, the millions of lives lost, the shattered landscapes, the psychological scars that would endure for generations.
Let's talk about Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia. This document, it played a pivotal role in escalating the crisis, didn't it?
Absolutely. The ultimatum was, well, deliberately harsh. Demands Austria-Hungary knew would be difficult, if not impossible, for Serbia to accept. Almost as if they were looking for an excuse for war.
Can you give us some examples of the demands?
Sure. They demanded Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, dismiss officials involved in the assassination plot, even allow Austrian officials to participate in the investigation within Serbia, basically surrender their sovereignty.
So, not really a negotiation then. More of a diktat designed to provoke a reaction.
It seems that way. Austria-Hungary was determined to use the assassination as an opportunity to solidify their control over the Balkans. They were willing to risk war to achieve their goals.
And Germany, with their blank check of support, was complicit in this strategy.
Oh, absolutely. Germany's unconditional backing emboldened Austria-Hungary, gave them the confidence to pursue a hard line with Serbia.
So even if Serbia had completely capitulated to the ultimatum, do you think war could have been avoided?
That's a tough question. It's possible Austria-Hungary, having already made their decision, would have found another reason to invade regardless of Serbia's response. But it's also possible that a more, shall we say, conciliatory approach by Austria-Hungary, perhaps with pressure from other European powers, could have averted the conflict.
It's a sobering thought. A few different choices, a bit more restraint, a willingness to compromise, and perhaps millions of lives could have been spared.
It really underscores the tragic consequences of unchecked ambition, the dangers of nationalistic fervor. When diplomacy fails and leaders choose aggression over compromise, the results are often catastrophic.
Now that we've explored the lead-up to the war, I think it's time to turn our attention to the war itself. World War I was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Unprecedented scale and brutality. A conflict that shattered the illusions of 19th century Europe and ushered in a new era of warfare. Technological advancements, devastating firepower, unimaginable human suffering.
We've talked about the romanticized view of war that many held at the beginning. How did that perception change as the reality set in?
Well, that initial enthusiasm, it quickly gave way to disillusionment and despair as the war dragged on, and the casualty lists grew. The romantic notions of glorious battles and swift victories, shattered by the brutal reality of trench warfare, constant bombardment, poison gas attacks, horrific injuries, the sheer scale of death.
Let's talk about trench warfare. This was a defining feature of World War I, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Trench warfare was a grim, brutal form of combat. Miles of interconnected trenches dug into the earth, stretching across the battlefields of France and Belgium. Soldiers lived in these cramped, muddy, rat-infested ditches. Constant exposure to enemy fire, disease, the psychological strain of prolonged combat.
In our sources, we have some really powerful first-hand accounts, letters and diaries from soldiers describing the horrors they witnessed.
They paint such a vivid picture of life in the trenches, the constant fear of artillery bombardment, the deafening explosions, seeing your comrades maimed or killed, the stench of death, the despair of knowing that you could be next.
They really humanize the conflict. Remind us that behind the statistics, the grand narratives, there are millions of individual stories of suffering and loss.
They also offer a glimpse into the psychological toll of the war. The shell shock, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the trauma that many veterans carried long after the guns fell silent.
Before we move on to the global impact, I want to focus on a particular aspect of World War I, the role of technology. This conflict saw the introduction of new weapons, new tactics that would change warfare forever.
You're right. World War I was a watershed moment in military history. The deployment of new technologies on an unprecedented scale. Technologies that amplified the destructive power of war and, sadly, led to unimaginable casualties.
Can you give us some specific examples?
One of the most significant, the machine gun. Its rapid-fire capability transformed the battlefield, made frontal assaults incredibly costly. Artillery, with its heavy guns firing shells over vast distances, inflicted massive damage on trenches and infrastructure. Poison gas, agonizing deaths, terror in the hearts of soldiers.
It's a chilling reminder of how human ingenuity can be turned toward such destructive purposes.
It doesn't stop there. We also saw the rise of tanks, armored vehicles that could cross no man's land, break through enemy lines, airplanes. Initially used for reconnaissance, but quickly evolved into weapons platforms, dogfights dropping bombs, submarines lurking beneath the waves, disrupting shipping lanes, a whole new dimension to naval warfare.
So World War I became a testing ground for these new technologies, a horrifying laboratory of death and destruction.
It was a stark demonstration of how technological advancements, while often touted as progress, can have devastating consequences when used for warfare.
Now let's widen our view and consider the global impact of the war. It wasn't just a European conflict, was it?
No, not at all. Truly a global conflict, participants from every continent, and it left its mark on the entire world.
How did the war affect countries beyond Europe?
Well, it had profound consequences for colonies and empires around the world. Millions of men from Africa, Asia, the Americas mobilized to fight in a war that, in many ways, wasn't theirs. Forced to fight and die for their colonial masters, often in brutal, unfamiliar conditions.
A tragic example of how global power dynamics played out on the battlefields of Europe.
It also accelerated the decline of European colonialism. Soldiers from colonized nations fighting for freedom and democracy in Europe returned home with a heightened awareness of their own oppression. The war exposed the hypocrisy of European powers, preaching liberty while denying it to their own subjects. This fueled nationalist movements, demands for independence across the colonial world.
So the war sowed the seeds for the dismantling of empires, the rise of new nation-states.
One of the many unintended consequences. World War I reshaped the political landscape, not just of Europe, but of the entire world.
As we near the end of our deep dive, I want to touch upon one final aspect of World War I, the human cost. We've talked about trench warfare, the technological advancements, but what about the human toll, the sheer number of lives lost, families shattered, the psychological scars?
The human cost of World War I is almost impossible to grasp. Over 16 million people died, soldiers and civilians. Millions more wounded, physically and psychologically. Entire generations decimated, leaving scars on families, communities across the globe.
We have heartbreaking accounts in our sources. Families who lost multiple sons, mothers grieving for children they'd never see again, wives left to raise families alone, coping with loss and trauma.
Those stories remind us that war isn't about abstract goals or territorial disputes. It's about people, individuals with hopes and dreams, families, communities whose lives are irrevocably changed by violence and chaos.
And the impact wasn't limited to those on the front lines. The war had profound consequences for civilians as well.
Of course. Cities bombed, shelled, leaving destruction in their wake. Economies devastated, industries disrupted, food shortages, millions displaced, becoming refugees, fleeing to foreign lands in search of safety.
A reminder that war isn't a contained event. Its effects spread far and wide, touching every aspect of society.
It also left a profound psychological legacy. The trauma of combat, the loss, the breakdown of social structures, all contributed to a sense of disillusionment, despair that permeated the post-war world. The old certainties were shattered, the belief in progress, the faith in human reason, a generation scarred by violence, haunted by memories of a world gone mad.
And this disillusionment, this loss of faith, paved the way for new ideologies, radical and reactionary, that shaped the 20th century.
Exactly. The war created fertile ground for extremism, both on the left and the right. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, the spread of communist and fascist movements, all can be traced back, in part, to the disillusionment and upheaval that followed the war.
It's a reminder that the consequences of war go far beyond the battlefield, lasting long after the guns fall silent.
The true cost of war isn't just lives lost and cities destroyed. It's the shattered dreams, the broken families, the lost innocence, and the long-term social and political upheavals.
And that's a powerful lesson to take away from our exploration of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of World War I. A cautionary tale. The fragility of peace, the dangers of unchecked ambition, the enduring consequences of violence and conflict. We've explored the tangled web of alliances, the missteps, the horrors of the trenches, and the devastating human cost. But as we wrap up our deep dive, what kind of world emerged from the ashes of World War I? How did this conflict reshape things, set the stage for the rest of the 20th century?
It's like looking at a before and after picture, really. The world was fundamentally changed. Politically, socially, geographically, empires crumbled, new nations were born, and that old order, gone.
Let's start with the most obvious change. The map of Europe was completely redrawn, wasn't it? Can you walk us through that?
Imagine, if you were, a map of Europe in 1914. Vast empires everywhere you look. Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German. Now, fast forward to 1919. Those empires vanished. In their place, a patchwork of brand new nation-states. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland. Countries that simply didn't exist before the war, born from the wreckage.
It's incredible. It really shows the transformative power of the war, doesn't it? Shattered the old and brought in something new.
And it wasn't just about creating new countries. There were major territorial shifts, too. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, big chunks of land in the east, to the newly formed Poland. Austria-Hungary was broken apart, its territories divided. And the Ottoman Empire, long considered the sick man of Europe, well, it finally collapsed, its territories divvied up by the victors.
So the war, it was like a catalyst, wasn't it? Speeding up changes that were already happening, exposed the weaknesses of those old empires, unleashed the forces of nationalism, redrawing boundaries, reshaping identities.
Precisely. And it wasn't just Europe. The war's impact went far beyond. It had huge implications for the colonial world, too.
Right, we've talked about the colonial troops who fought in the war. How did the war affect the relationship between those European powers and their colonies?
It exposed the contradictions at the heart of colonialism. Here were these European powers fighting, they said, for democracy, for self-determination. Yet at the same time, they were denying those very rights to the people they colonized.
Talk about hypocrisy.
Exactly. And that hypocrisy wasn't lost on those who had fought and died alongside their European counterparts. That experience fueled nationalist movements, demands for independence throughout the colonial world.
So it's like the war sowed the seeds for the end of empires, didn't it? Set in motion the whole process of decolonization that would play out through the 20th century.
That's exactly it. It weakened the European powers, both economically and morally, and it empowered those nationalist movements in the colonies. They had the experience now, the organization, and the moral authority to challenge their rulers.
Now, beyond the political upheavals, the changes to maps, World War I also had a deep impact on society, technology, even culture. Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. The war, it sped up technological developments, particularly in areas like medicine, transportation, communication. Treating those battlefield injuries led to new surgical techniques, wound care, the development of airplanes, automobiles, pushed forward by the demands of war, and radio communication, vital for coordinating those military operations. It ended up paving the way for the mass media revolution of the 20th century.
So in a strange way, the war, even with all the suffering and destruction, actually pushed progress forward.
It's a complicated legacy for sure. Those advancements, driven by military needs at first, ended up having ripple effects on civilian life, changing the way we live, work, communicate.
And what about the role of women? The war changed that too, didn't it? With the men away fighting, women had to step into those roles in factories, on farms, in offices. It challenged those traditional gender roles, didn't it? Showed what women were truly capable of.
Absolutely. The war forced societies to rethink their assumptions about women. They proved they could handle jobs that were previously considered men's work, and they contributed so much to the war effort. It really laid the foundation for the women's suffrage movement, that broader push for gender equality in the decades that followed.
So while the war was, without a doubt, a terrible tragedy, it was also a catalyst for change, socially, culturally. It sped up trends that were already happening, created new possibilities.
A reminder, I think, that even the worst parts of history can have unintended consequences, shaping the world in ways that are both destructive and transformative.
Now, as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to come back to a question we've touched on throughout our conversation. What's the legacy of World War I? We've discussed the political shifts, the social change, the technological leaps. But what did we learn from this catastrophic event?
The lessons of World War I are many, and they're complex. It's a stark reminder of the danger of nationalism when it runs unchecked, how fragile peace can be, and the devastating consequences of militarism. It underlines the importance of diplomacy, of clear communication, the need to find peaceful solutions to international disagreements.
And it also highlights how interconnected the world is, right? Something that happens in one corner of the globe can have effects that ripple out everywhere, impacting nations and people across continents.
A lesson that's perhaps even more important today than it was a century ago. In a world facing globalization, climate change, the spread of weapons of mass destruction.
It's a sobering thought, for sure, but an important one to remember as we face the challenges of our own time. The echoes of World War I are still with us. They remind us of the human cost of conflict, the urgent need for peace, for understanding, for cooperation. And that's where we'll leave our deep dive into this pivotal moment in history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.